the planning department, Brian?
Since all hell broke loose.
Oh,
Legitimately
the
the day.
Yeah,
Welcome.
the day. It's all my fault.
Oh dear.
Brian started on like, what was it, the 15th or the 16th of March, and we were
wow.
some breakfast for him. And around the table during our welcome to the planning department breakfast, Rob came down and said, let's make plans to send everybody home tomorrow.
Wow.
We said, thanks, Brian, for bringing this to us. But Brian, I'll tell you guys a little bit about Brian. He'll tell you more about himself, I'm sure, at some point along the way. But Brian comes to us. He has been working in Coventry for the last few years. We are very, very lucky to have him. These are the pieces Brian won't say about himself, I bet. We are very, very lucky to have him. He comes incredibly highly recommended from, I think, anybody who has ever worked with him in the due diligence I did before we hired him. So we are very lucky to have Brian. He has a very, very deep history of environmental and law before that, and has been working in Coventry with the planning department there for the last few years. And we are really, really, really glad to have him.
And I'm really, really happy to be here. So, and I'm really enjoyed, despite everything that's happened, I've really enjoyed the last couple of months working here. So I'm expecting great things from the next few years. So.
Awesome. Welcome.
Brian, has Coventry started their meetings online, or are they pretty much just on hold right now?
I have no idea. The last time I checked back was, very early on, and they hadn't yet started doing the Zoom meetings. I would assume they have to be into it at this point.
Yeah.
We did a survey of all the municipalities, and essentially, with a handful of exceptions, everyone starting in May started doing some level of virtual meetings.
Well, their acting town manager over there was actually their IT guy. So I would assume that he felt like this was an obligatory call to him, and I'm sure he got everything up and running pretty quickly.
And Kayla, when is your last day?
My last day is that's a scary thing to even say out loud, I think. My last day is, the earliest it will be the 26th of June, but it is more likely to be sort of a week or two after that.
Well, we're going to greatly miss you. You've done an incredible job as planning director.
Well, I feel like I have had more to work with in this town with all of you people and all of the resources that this town puts towards planning than I think I ever dreamed I would have as a planner. And it has been a really, really, really rewarding experience for me to work with you all and work in a town where there's like this much actual interest in figuring out how to make sure you're moving towards your vision. I am very used to working with towns where no one shows up to things. And so you're sort of you're planning, but you're planning a little bit in a vacuum. And so I have gained more from you than I have given, I am sure of it.
So do you have anything lined up in Vermont yet?
Yeah, I do.
Or is that still a work in progress?
No, I do. Well, where I used to work actually before I came here has sort of never really resigned themselves to the fact that I actually did leave. And so I'm actually going back to, when I left there, I was doing their transportation planning. And now I'm going to actually go back and be directing their community planning and economic development for them. So.
And where in Vermont is that? Is that near Berlin?
The crazy thing is, Joe, it's not even in Vermont.
Or?
It's not even in Vermont. I'll be living in Vermont because that's where our home is, but it's just over the border from New Hampshire. So it's northern 51 communities of New Hampshire all together that we sort of, they have more of a regional planning model up there. So it's a regional planning position. And so that's going to be, It's going to be interesting. It's going to be very good. They're a very flexible organization, so I can work remotely from my home in Vermont 4 days a week, and then be traveling to go to sort of meetings and things on top of that. And that's sort of something they work for, like work-life balance. So that's how it kind of can work for me, going back right now. And my husband actually, when we moved down here, decided not to open a solar business with a friend of his, but a large reason we're moving back is because he lost his position permanently down here in COVID-19, which has had some pretty heavy duty impacts for us. And he's going to actually go and sort of be jumping back in as a partner to that business. So we're looking for houses kind of in between like Montpelier and like St. Johnsbury is sort of the area where we're going to be. Our families are from like Lyndonville and Burke. So when I'm sort of wearing my hat on the family small business, we spend a lot of time up there. So somewhere in the sort of northeast region of the state is where we'll land.
Well, best of luck. We're certainly going to miss you.
Thanks.
Yeah,
I hope to not be a stranger to you guys. You like to ski, I like to surf. We'll see.
So it's after 7:15. It does not look like we're gonna pull off a quorum, but we do have Jeff here and Brian here. How do you all feel about at least getting an update on the project while we've all put on our tops that are really fancy? So everybody okay with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, it doesn't work. Yes, I'm okay with that.
Okay. So yes, we're not having an official meeting then, so no need for roll call and all of that, but maybe we'll just turn it right over to you, Jeff.
Sure. So yeah, just to give you a little bit of an update, of course, we were making plans back in January to move things right along, and Kayla and I had grand plans, and then COVID. I feel like this poor project just can't catch a break, but we move forward. We always move forward. So what we had been planning right when Brian started, I think the next day we were planning on doing a public open house to talk about the first 3 major policy changes related to this project. And that had to do with accessory apartments, cottage communities, and inclusionary zoning. As if you recall, we had, sorry, I just got a brand new phone. I don't know how to deal with it yet. I'm going to move it away. We had met with the planning board and you all last fall, and had gone over the first big survey that we had conducted earlier in the fall. And that had gotten over 500 responses, or set the tone for what people were most interested in. And so that's what led us to tackling inclusionary zoning, cottage communities, and accessory apartments first. They seem to be things that people are really interested in, and quote unquote easy wins, things that we might be able to accomplish early. So the event in March that was canceled was turned into an online survey, a very robust online survey. We basically took the poster boards that we would have displayed in person and embedded those into the survey so that people could read that before they answered. We got 77 responses in total, which compared to the 500 plus we got in the fall was really disappointing. Although, as Kayla pointed out, had we had 77 people show up at a public open house, we would have been doing cartwheels. I mean, that would have been amazing. So two different ways to look at that. So I just wanted to take a moment to go over with you the results of that survey. We are going to be discussing this with the planning board next week. My hope is that based on this survey, which the questions were developed based on the last round of conversations that the planning board had on these topics back in February. So we hope that this will give them some support and say, okay, there's general, at least from the 77 people who showed up, there's a general direction as to how people feel about some of these policy issues. So first topic, accessory apartments.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm gonna jump in really quick because I want to add a little bit that you don't know as well as I
Oh,
do.
okay.
Guys know, which is that the planning board discussed them at the work session in February. You guys also discussed them at a meeting.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.
We'd done a little bit of like figuring out where we thought we were headed in those meetings. And then the questions Jeff and I put into the open house, the virtual, which became the virtual open house, were basically ways for us to say, okay, this path we seem to be headed in, is this something that the 7 of you and the 7 of the planning board members are interested in, but is a little offbeat with what the community, other people are thinking? Or is this something that they're sort of in the direction of? So the questions in the survey were not really sort of like survey oriented questions. They were a little bit like, this is where we're headed and how do you feel about that? Jeff, do you want me to screen share the document or you want to just talk them through?
I think I'm okay to talk through it. If anyone feels at any point like you'd like to see it, I mean, it's not a presentation. I'm just going through the memo that we pulled together. Let me know, but I think we're probably okay just talking through it. But again, up to you guys. If at any point you want Kayla to screen share, just holler. So yes, thank you, Kayla. That puts it more succinctly. That this survey was really about ground truthing the policy directions that this group of the planning board were already considering. And I will say, in that role, it was a success. I would say that every question, every policy direction that you were looking at, a majority of respondents were comfortable with that direction. So the first piece was the accessory apartments. And one of the questions that we were dealing with was the fact that right now, if you're building an accessory dwelling unit in the R10, the R20, or the R30 zoning districts, you have to have perhaps 50% larger lot if you're on sewer and 100% larger lot if you're not. And our question was, is that fair? Should we require these larger lot sizes to incorporate an accessory apartment, or should it just be okay to build them on the size of parcel that you already have? So we have this in a 3-part question. Basically, we asked, should lots be allowed to stay the same and build an accessory apartment? Should they be somewhat larger, but not as large as you require today? Or should they have to meet the current lot size standards? And so the most strongly accepted of these options was the first one, that you would not have to make your lot any larger in these districts in order to have an accessory apartment. 62% of the respondents either agreed or strongly agreed with this, and just under 30% disagreed. So again, that was a positive thing, reinforced the direction that you're inclined to go. When you look at the flip side of that, that the people who felt that things should stay the same, that you should continue to allow or require larger lots for accessory apartments, again, you have about 35% who agree with that. So it was sort of a flip. You could see the people who didn't agree with the first one agreed with the other and vice versa. I think it was a pretty clean split. But again, about 2/3 of people, of respondents, would be comfortable with not requiring a larger lot size for accessory apartments. The second question had to do with the water conservation requirements that you currently require for accessory apartments in the R200 zone, in your least dense zone. The question was, does it make sense to require these water conservation requirements for accessory apartments, or should they really just apply to anything within the town's groundwater protection overlay district? And when asked that question directly, 70% of respondents said, yes, you shouldn't be tying this to accessory apartments, you should be tying it to any development within the groundwater protection overlay district. And of course, if you do go that direction, right now, those requirements are geared specifically towards accessory apartments. So for example, there's no washer dryers allowed. Sorry, you got to take into consideration, you're really not going to allow washer and dryers for anyone or any development within that district. But I do think it's fair to say that people will be comfortable with taking another look at those water conservation requirements specific to the groundwater protection overlay and just divorce it from the conversation around accessory apartments. And then finally, third question, there are currently height limits for accessory buildings that would make it impossible in certain cases for someone to take a garage and build an accessory apartment over it. You just don't have enough headroom to make that happen and comply with the height limits. So the question was, should it be okay to make exceptions for these height limits for accessory buildings so long as they're being used for an accessory apartment? And 68% of respondents said yes. So I guess I will pause before we move on to cottage communities, but does anyone have any questions about those responses, about accessory apartments? Again, very, pretty strong support for the policy directions that this group and the planning board are heading in.
Jeff, the accessory apartments, they were described as they are today, 750 square feet and no more than one bedroom?
That's correct. So we are just taking the existing parameters for accessory apartments and applying these additional policy questions.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we'll move on to cottage communities. As those of you who I think you're all part of the meeting in the fall, that was the #1 housing alternative when we were looking at the missing middle housing opportunities. Cottages were very, very popular across the board and got very high interest from the public. So the first thing we asked about cottages is where are they appropriate? Where in town should we allow them? And the survey had 4 different areas, many of which overlap, but would help define where these could be built. Any of the village centers, the R40 zone or denser, so the R40, the 30, the 20, the 10, only where existing water and sewer are, or anywhere in the future sewer service area if sewer is provided. So it doesn't have to be there today, but so long as it's in that sewer service area and it will be provided as part of the development. So of those 4 options, the village centers was the most popular. 68% of respondents said they would support cottages in any of the village centers. The next most popular was within the future sewer service area. That was 61% of respondents would be comfortable with cottages anywhere within that area. And then for the other 2 options, for the R40 or denser, or the only where there's existing sewer and water, just under half of respondents were comfortable with that. And actually, across the board, the people who are not comfortable with any of these options ranged from 21% to 28%. So definitely a minority of folks were not comfortable with cottages in any of these areas. It's really the people who said maybe or they were unsure that caused the yes responses to go down for the R40 or denser or the where existing water and sewer is. But again, I think that gives you a pretty clear direction that most people would be comfortable with the village centers, all of which I believe are within the future sewer service area anyway. So you could really go with either of those parameters. Next,
The place where it deviates, I'm going to sort of just add some other pieces to it. The place where that it deviates, where future sewer service area doesn't catch the villages, is Matunik. Trying to think of
which I never really consider as part of your core villages anyway.
Right, like it feels very separate, right? But like Matunik, Green Hill, those areas don't have sewer. Those would be the ones that if you went with sewer, you'd lose Matunik, and Green Hill, you'd lose the beach areas. If you went with the village centers, you could probably try and fold those back in.
So go ahead.
Maybe join. Sorry, Jeff. I keep interrupting you, but I think maybe we've had a 4th AHC member join. I see Kenny Burke's tile. I haven't heard him and I haven't seen him yet. So maybe if we see or hear from Ken, then we'll call it a quorum. But if he's sort of just here as a phantom Ken, then we'll.
Hey, folks. Unfortunately, I'm traveling on the road, so I'm not trying to watch the video, and I'm putting myself on mute. But I am here.
So does that count as quorum?
Yeah, what are the rules on quorum when someone is not on video on a Zoom call?
Not on video on a Zoom call can still count as long as we can hear. The piece ends up being if he can communicate his pieces or his opinions and hear what's going on, then we're good.
All right.
Then do we need to?
Let's, if we could be odd here. Do we want?
Okay, I'm here. I pulled over, but I'm going to shut the video off. I am participating, if that's okay. I'm sorry. I have a union issue I'm attending to, so I am participating, but I'm opting not to be on video because I'm in my vehicle.
That sounds safe and like the and thanks for being here. The reason we're getting a little funny about this right now is we were sort of giving a non-official AHC meeting, just update from Jeff on the project. But so now that we've got you, we've got a quorum. So I think it probably is proper, Jen, to have you just sort of call the meeting to order.
To order. Yes. Okay. So we'll do our housekeeping now.
And then we'll just jump right back to where Jeff got interrupted.
Absolutely. So at 7:32 p.m., we're going to call the Affordable Housing Collaborative to order on Thursday, June 4th. And you want to do roll call? We'll just all say who's here, or I can say who I see. What do we prefer for minutes? So Jen Kruger, Christian Blaney, Josh Daly, Kenny Burke, Joe Murphy, Kayla from planning, Brian from planning, Jeff from Horsley Witten. Okay. Did everybody look at the minutes?
Yes.
We want to go ahead and just quickly get a motion to approve the minutes unless there are corrections.
Motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So Ken, we just need you to vote for approval of the minutes. You can go back on mute. So much suspense for our minutes.
It looks like he's on mute still.
We can take him off
Can
mute.
you unmute him, Kayla?
I can ask to unmute him. It'll pester him and remind him that we're here looking for him.
I'm not sure if you got that, but I do concur with the minutes.
Oh,
Thanks.
okay. Wonderful. And we don't have any members of the public here for public comment. And with that, we can jump right back into our update.
All right. So recall, we're talking about cottage communities. We just talked about the areas where people felt they would be appropriate. And the two most popular were within the village centers and anywhere within the future sewer service area. So the next question related to cottage communities was how important design was to folks as opposed to affordability. Because really these types of homes can be a more affordable option given their size, but we do know that there's also a very strong demand for houses like this, and if done completely at the market rate, could end up being quite pricey. So interestingly, the majority of respondents, we asked people to do a 0 to 10. 0 meaning that you care more about design, 10 meaning you care more about affordability. And the majority of respondents voted a 5. So right in between, suggesting that they value design and affordability equally. Interestingly, the next most common response was a 0, meaning those people who value design more highly. And then third were the 10s, the people who valued affordability above design. But I don't know, I thought that was very South Kingstown. South Kingstown wants it all, right? You want a pretty
Yes.
house that's affordable.
There's either lots of gray area or no gray area.
Right? So those are the two major questions about cottage communities. You know, when we went back and looked at the draft that we had, I think it was looked at pretty favorably. I think one of the other hanging questions related to this design issue was how much we should demand in terms of materials. You know, should we be a little laxer on the type of materials that can be used so that we're not artificially inflating prices? I think there was also a concern about flexibility, that if we were too prescriptive about design, that could also add costs. So you know, that's one of the things that we tried to accomplish with this draft of cottage zoning, is that you'd have a laundry list of design features and you could pick 5 of them or 3 or whatever the number is, just so long as there was some variety from building to building. You could choose what specific architectural variation you wanted as a designer. But overall, I think you probably have a pretty clear shot to getting cottage zoning passed. Any questions on this concept?
Quick question for you, Jeff. Did the cottage zoning part, did it give a description of like the size or type of property, you know, square footage or anything like that when it was describing a cottage, just out of curiosity?
Yes. So I'm trying to remember if the survey described this, but so for each of these questions, we had a board that basically explained, here's what the policy is now, or in the case of cottage zoning, here's what cottages are, here's what they normally look like. I can't remember if we had size, but we had a general description of this is what we're talking about. We had pictures from other communities that have used cottages. But in the draft now, I think there's a square footage limit of 1,200 square feet total, and a 900 square foot footprint.
And then was there a lot size element in there? You know, 5,000 square foot lot or something, or 7,500 square foot lot or anything like that?
So right now, as written, it would have at least 6 units and no more than 36 units. And there was a minimum lot size for that. A lot of communities will choose to only allow them on joint lots. I think the way we have it written now is that they can be separate lots. That's a detail that's up to the town. Well, actually, I do have that. I think we did delineate. Yes, the maximum density should be 15 cottage units per developable acre. Again, that's all those numbers are for sure negotiable. That's just a number that we've seen work in other communities.
And that 15, like for people who aren't used to doing math on dwelling units to lot size, that like 15 dwelling units an acre, if an acre has 43,360 square feet, ends up being at 15 of them, you divide it by a third, gives us number I thought I could do in my head and can't.
Nope.
But
Less than 3,000 square feet, right?
yeah, I was going to say, I think it roughly lands right around there.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely much smaller than what's required in the R10, but not out of line with some of the existing denser historic village centers throughout the town.
Excellent. Thank you.
Start putting in there things like they require open space, right?
Mhm.
They require like a park-like component or some sort of open space to it. So, the thought is in big picture, I think the thing that makes cottages seem different, and honestly a reason why cottages have had success in a lot of communities where general increases in density might not have been supported as well, or is because they tend to have, it's not just a one. It's not you can build one small thing on this very small lot. It's if you put a bunch of these small ones together and create a space with it that's got open space that has some feel to it, it doesn't feel like parceling out one home for one small lot. It's sort of more of one cluster, right? It's one grouping of things, and they can benefit from each other in that way. They tend to have requirements, the regs tend to have requirements about how many cars and how much space can go to parking and where it has to be located, so that it keeps this feeling of being this integrated space that they're all kind of able to use to create a whole and not necessarily just a lot by lot thing. That's largely the reason that I think cottages are something that South Kingstown might be interested in, whereas generally decreasing to let people build on a 3,000 square foot lot if they kept their individual home very small might not be interesting. That's sort of the cottage thing that keeps it unique.
And one of the questions that the planning board had, I don't know if this is something that this group discussed, was the minimum number of units in any cottage community. We're recommending 6, primarily because 6 would trigger your inclusionary zoning. Of course, you may end up altering your inclusionary zoning trigger, but we do think it's very important to have some sort of affordability component to any cottage development, just because I think the demand is going to be very high. And if these were strictly market rates, I don't think it would add much to your affordability. I mean, whether you're low to moderate income stock or just general, market rate affordability. Right. Let's talk inclusionary zoning. So start this one off with an apology. I framed just the logistics of this question on SurveyMonkey. I did it incorrectly. So we did not get the type of responses that we wanted. I take full responsibility for that. But I think there are still some takeaways from what we did ask. So we were trying to get at the area median income, the percent of area median income that is appropriate for LMI ownership versus rental for inclusionary units. I will point out that we lost a lot of people once we started asking questions about inclusionary zoning. 17 people skipped these questions, and the majority answered all of the others. So I don't know if there's just a lack of understanding about what inclusionary zoning is, or really getting in the weeds on zoning, and people didn't know how to answer, so they just chose not to answer. But I think that's an important caveat before we go over these results. But basically, we laid out what's appropriate at 80% AMI, 60%, 100%, 120%. And unfortunately, the way we set it up, you had to answer, at 120%, what's more appropriate, home ownership or rental? You're asking people to choose between those two, as opposed to, yes, I think this is appropriate for home ownership, and yes, I think this is appropriate for rental homes. So what that tells us, though, is 120% AMI, 83% of people said that they would be more appropriate for home ownership than rental. And basically, and this is no surprise, the lower the AMI, the more people thought it was appropriate for rental. I mean, honestly, this is something that at the end of the day is something that staff and these boards and committees should be deciding and really taking into consideration the stomach for this of the development community. It doesn't really impact the average resident. It doesn't impact the product that's made or how it looks in the neighborhood. It really is a policy function that I think really should be more in your hands than the opinion of the general public. But you still have some decisions to make on this point. Right now, the limit is 80% AMI, which in my research I consider to be best practice. I think that makes sense. There are a number of communities that go up to 100% AMI, particularly for home ownership. And I know 120% AMI is popular for a lot of communities, but I would just caution that you get up to that AMI, and that's nearly an income of $100,000 a year. And at that point, you know, $100,000 a year doesn't go as far as it used to, but people can find a market rate home that they can afford with that kind of income. So you start competing with the open market at that point, and you get to a point where it's hard to move those 120% AMI units because people who have that level of income, you know, if they have the choice of buying something without a D restriction versus something that does have a D restriction, most people are going to choose the former. So again, as you consider this policy point, we think that where you are now at 80% makes sense. If you felt like going up to 100%, that would probably be acceptable. We would encourage you to go down to 60% for rental. The need for more deeply subsidizing rentals is really borne out by the statistics in the community. Yeah, that's where we are on that issue for now. The other questions related to inclusionary zoning. So we asked if people would support having greater bonus density for inclusionary zoning units, or just strictly applying inclusionary zoning to areas where you want greater density. So for example, in the village centers within the future sewer area. And again, either not providing greater bonus density or not allowing IZ at all, we don't really want to see denser development, such as the R200 zone. And this was very strong. A majority, 71%, would support a policy that put that density, or focused the density where you want it and decreased it where you don't want it. So that was one of the policy discussions that at least the planning board was having, and I assume this group as well. And then lastly, was this issue of parity between market rate units and inclusionary units. And right now, you know, there's really no standard. If someone builds a 4-bedroom house, they can make their inclusionary unit a little 1-bedroom cottage. So the question was, if you have, for example, a market rate home of 4 bedrooms each, that the inclusionary units should also have 4 bedrooms, or at least you should have 2 units with 2 bedrooms each. That you should have an equivalent number of bedrooms between the affordable and the market rate units. And this was very strongly favored. 79% of respondents supported that concept. So I think those are all some really low-hanging fruit to amend your existing IZ law. I think there's still a lot of debate and uncertainty about providing the bonus density in the first place. I don't know if there's been further discussion on that of late, but your own town attorney, our attorneys have suggested that as your IZ is set up now, it does not include bonus density per state law and is not in accordance with state law in that regard. So we have proposed a couple options for bonus density that we feel would meet state law. The other big question, policy question related to IZ is whether you're going to allow a fee in lieu. You don't currently. Certainly an option. The state is now very prescriptive about how that works. So if you do it, there's really no debate. There's one way for you to do it. There's one way to calculate what that fee would be, because that is set by state law. Those are really the two major hanging policy discussions around IZ.
Inclusionary zoning, I'm just going to sort of riff on that, Jeff, if I can. But inclusionary zoning, I can't agree with Jeff more. This is a complicated one to try and get public feedback on because it is a world of competing incentives and economic balancing on development costs versus purchase price versus family incomes versus household sizes, how standard subdivision and development laws interplay with affordable housing laws and development. There are so many I mean, it is an affordable housing is one of the biggest problems facing most places right now. And the regulations that have gotten put in place to handle it come from different areas at different times. And when you put them all together, it is an incredibly complicated landscape where a feedback question asked to the public at large to say, what percentage would you be interested in, that comes back with a number is very much a, well, that sounds better. But when we start thinking about what we're actually going to do as a community and a policy choice, it is about balancing all of those different competing interests and how one thing interplays with another. Like when Jeff is pointing out that going up to 120% of area median income can sometimes be challenging because of the people trying to have the income to qualify to purchase those homes can often stretch their income a little further and buy a non-deed restricted home, or maybe can find a non-deed restricted home that is priced at the same price. I want to throw that out as an example too, because the home we bought here is a home that would have qualified as an affordable house, but was not deed restricted. And we found something that was affordable, but not deed restricted. And so you start to get into a place where people have a wider set of options and they're able to sort of pursue those options. So they're a harder unit to sell. They're also a unit that is at a sale price of 120% on the development side. If they went to 100, there's just pieces to it on all sides. That's sort of where we get to on it. People tend to look to go to 120% when they're looking to get 120% affordable units. The developers we're seeing looking to do that tend to lean towards a comprehensive permit. They tend to get that relief, right? They'll give a little bit more affordable housing, and then the state law for comprehensive permits lets them bring that price point up to 120%, right? Not 125, 120% of the area median income. And so there's one thought that says, okay, well, if our rules let you go up that high, is that going to increase the number of people who play within our rules? Or we are actually just going to find that there are less of them being created through inclusionary zoning and more people just sort of saying, well, maybe I come at it from a different way. But we have seen them be a challenge for people to sell, for developers to sell. They tend to get interested oftentimes, and this is sort of really what I've observed. Developers are more interested in a home that they think they can sell for 120% of area median income, but they may not be thinking about what it actually is going to be to find that home buyer. And then, so we've had recently a developer come in, get relief to bring that price point up to 120%, and then come in again with their hands thrown up to me going, Kayla, what can I do now? Nobody wants to buy them at this price. And we said, you sort of traded one problem for the other. And the bigger problem of the community is affordability. So perhaps you sort of keep yourself leaning more towards your affordability side, keeping that area median income lower if your bigger community problem is the affordability on these things in general. Because the 120% ones, they start to have a different set of issues to them.
And the other good thing about decreasing the AMI and also increasing your bonus density is it becomes more palatable for the developer to actually follow your rules and create the units. So right now, we've interviewed several local developers. They will turn themselves into pretzels to avoid your current inclusionary zoning. Anything they can do to keep from triggering that, they will keep from triggering it. Given the minuscule amount of units that have actually been produced through your IZ program, I think it makes sense to make it easier for developers to say yes and to follow the rules. And that's partly through changing your zoning. And partly one thing that this committee might want to consider as a role for itself, and pardon me, Brian and Kayla, if I'm speaking out of turn, there are a lot of things that the town can do just facilitate this process for developers. Making sure that the process is very clearly laid out. They don't have to, it doesn't have to be a mystery as to how this works. You can, have something in writing to give to folks. You could have model deed restrictions. Rely on Housing is happy to help with stuff like that. Example marketing plans for the fair housing marketing of these units once they're ready. Just all these things that your average developer who's used to doing a standard subdivision just isn't accustomed to and doesn't want to take the time to figure out. There are both changes to zoning and then ways that you can facilitate these conversations with developers that in tandem can help IZ be more productive for you, I think.
I'm wondering, I'm just thinking through, when you say that there's so many, it is a complicated issue, and so how do you get feedback on it? And it's often with all those different, balancing those different interests, it's how do I figure out what the outcomes are and what the actual cause is of that? So I guess what I'm wondering is, do we think that, do we want to try to engage in more education around that? Do we want to try to, or would you think of reframing things? What I wonder is, are there good studies or good data that show sort of trends and tendencies when you go one way or the other? And then, could you use that as a means of saying, questions less about, the balance and more about the outcome? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and honestly, I don't think you need research or study for that. Like, if you know what outcome you want, you prioritize that outcome in your policy.
Right.
And so if, meeting the needs of lower income households is your priority, then you stand firm on the 80%. But you see that, we're not getting developers to cooperate as is. So we have to give that bonus density. And then that goes to the question of, and I think this is, where we got some valid feedback from the public. What they're going to be concerned about is, how does this make my neighborhood different? How does this, change development patterns within the community? So we know that people are generally comfortable with seeing denser development, whether it be cottages, whether it be whatever, in the future sewer area and the village centers. Then I think you can say, all right, we're going to concentrate that bonus density in these areas because that's where it's going to be the most productive. And that's where we're going to be able to get the units that we need to serve as an incentive for developers to actually do this while, meeting your other townwide objectives of trying to limit development in, the green space you have. So I think your values should drive that policy decision. And I agree with Kayla that in the case of inclusionary zoning, so long as you are taking into consideration, the where and the how much that the general public has been weighing in on, the how, the mechanisms really should be up to you all and what works smoothly for you and local developers.
I think there's a larger question here too as to how, this is going to be a major part of shaping the future of the community, hopefully, right? After all the complexities of putting this program together, as Kayla said, it's a matter of what's the end user. Is it hopefully to attract people that want to move here with families and teachers and provide housing that folks can come here because we've got the dwindling child population, having grown up here and gone to high school here. I think Josh, you maybe did as well. We've gone to seeing the schools getting smaller and or is the end game more senior housing? In my financing world, we've seen more of this type of thing where you go through all of this for affordable housing and you have a development that's got 3 or 4 units and we end up doing financing for older folks that claim $80,000 a year but have $5 million in retirement in the bank, right? And they're putting 50% down. Is that really the best use of the affordable housing? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe it's no. That's really that's the part that I struggle with, is how can you make it most beneficial for whatever the end game is? And I think the end game is to continue to make it a vibrant community, not limit it to just families or limit it to just senior folks, make it available for both, but certainly make sure that, I don't know how you do it, that there's loopholes, that the loopholes aren't exploited. You know, people that have, I've done probably a dozen affordable housing mortgages in my career. I've been doing this about 15 years, and I haven't done one single one for a family. It's always somebody in that scenario that I mentioned before, in various areas around the state. And I think that's part of the problem with affordable housing, is figuring out what you want to do with it and how you want to make it work for whatever the end game is.
Well, and again, that's something that you can decide as a community. If you have noticed that there are other particular problems and you want us to look into policy solutions for closing loopholes like that, you can absolutely do that. I think one of the major policy questions I had for your current IZ is, there are a number of issues such as that, where you give yourself a lot, or give the planning board a lot of flexibility, where you say, you have to come up with some way to, partner with an agency that's going to monitor the resale of these units, and you kind of like leave it at that, and there's no real policy at the local level for how you follow up with that, and how do you ensure that what you want to occur in the types of households that you want in these homes are actually getting these homes. So in the draft that we provided, like we looked for some of those basic loopholes and tried to give suggestions for, this is where the town now has complete flexibility in how you handle this. And if that's working well for you, great. If you want some more guidance, then here are some recommendations. So if there's anything like that, where you're reading through this and you're like, but what if this happens? What if this happens? Then we can go back to the drawing board and try to come up with some solutions for those loopholes.
I'm not sure if I've heard of an affordable guidelines including an asset verification portion where
It's funny. I know one of the monitoring agents in the state who does look at it.
Is that right? They should. I mean, really. Yeah.
And one thing I've had this conversation, we've had this conversation all before together. The monitoring agents, because I'm pointing to Jeff Square, as Jeff is pointing out, Jeff is hitting sort of a nail on a head here, which is right now we just say you need to partner with a state approved monitoring agent. And monitoring agents are really different. I have realized that in the few years I've been here, that what Narragansett Housing does could be fundamentally different than the way Community Housing Land Trust does it. And one might actually tell you that a deed restriction that's valid for 30 years is done at the end of 30 years, regardless of how many people own it in that 30 years. And another one will tell you that 30 years starts over every time the home is resold. Some of them look at assets, some of them just look at income. And it's very, very different. And so the point Jeff's making is we could either continue to have that much ambiguity or diversity or options out there, or we could say there are things that aren't working. And so in South Kingstown, your monitoring agreement needs to provide the following basic things.
That's good to know.
Yeah, so we can absolutely draft something that addresses those concerns. So if you feel like, people are taking advantage of the system, we find ways to, people always find ways to take advantage of the system, but we'll do our best to close those loops. Yeah, so that's what I've got for you tonight. I'm excited. I think, after a lot of discussion, and God love you, South Kingstowners love to discuss and think because you're a smart bunch. I think we've got 3 very concrete policy directions that have a solid chance of getting some traction very soon.
So I'll do a little like where things go from here. So where this goes from here, the planning board Tuesday night will be talking through some of this. They'll be going a little more into the weeds. We've got sort of more discussion on the policies, crunching some numbers, looking at the draft regulations a little bit more. So we'll do a little bit more with them on this, but this survey information is part of their packet information for that meeting too. And then from there, what's going to happen is basically, so the planning board next Tuesday night will talk it out, give Jeff and Brian and me a little bit direction on sort of what sort of changes we're making into those regulations. And then we're going to try and see within a month or 6 weeks of that, us sort of having a place where we can having them in front of the planning board in a recommendation headed to the town council to a hearing where we can sort of bring the rubber to the road on this with some changes to the regulations and I'm sure a really engaging, hopefully public hearing on them.
That's good news. That's exciting.
And that's sort of like sweep 1 of this project. And sweep 2 and sweep 3 of this project will be the things that aren't those low-hanging fruits. The ones that we sort of needed to find our good footing and our good feel on how things were going to work in the community on these sort of low-hanging fruits. And then from there, we're going to go into a bit more stuff that takes a little bit more detail, right? A bit more on what shapes of other different kinds of missing middle housing might work in some of our villages. Which ones should be different, which ones should be similar. And then looking at how we start to consider mixed use in our commercial zones that are exclusively commercial to get residential in there because that's one of our biggest places to grow. And so those will sort of be the swoops 2 and 3 that what we're learning now and what we'll learn through the public hearing process on these widely supported so far as we can see policies in the community is where we're going to sort of find our footing on how we best pursue the ones that might be a little bit stickier, take a little bit more consideration to work through.
I do feel like it's very exciting to soon be able to answer the community questions about what have we done. Like people want to hear concrete things. And we've done a lot of work thinking about this and reaching out to the community, but I feel excited to be able to say, well, look, this actually changed, you know, and that's really gets the ball rolling too. I think it might even generate more excitement in the community when they see that the town is taking some actionable steps.
And, you know, once we get past this step, we'll have to, you know, do some work to resuscitate all the great work that was done prior to this related to the missing middle housing and remind people about the survey from last year and the survey of existing historic homes that meet these missing middle standards but can't be built today, like all that conversation that we had. You know, unfortunately, we sort of lost our momentum, but we'll have to start to, you know, hopefully this will be, like you said, a good way to get the momentum started again, do something concrete, and then get rolling on the rest of this again.
Anything else? Okay, shall we, I guess we sort of did our update on, are there any other updates from the planning department? No, okay.
No, not particularly. Brian might have a couple, but I don't have any.
No.
All I would sort of add in on planning department updates is we had a staff conversation with Jeff on Friday of last week, and one of the things we talked about in that meeting was trying to figure out how we can be a little bit more accessible. So I'll let you guys know. So when people fill out the survey, they fill out the survey. Some of them send me an email with their thoughts on the world. And a few of the people who sent emails with some of their thoughts on what we're doing here were nervous about us moving forward new policy during COVID-19 and in these ways and really sort of feeling hungry for us to have more opportunity to hear from each other and to have conversations together. And so we were talking a little bit about how we do that when we really can't invite them all together. And so one thing we talked about was trying to get into a situation where we maybe have a planner's drop-in hour that happens once a week, where we say, planner drop-in hours, we're talking about housing. And so we're on a Zoom meeting and we're there just in our offices, hanging out, drinking coffee, working on things. But as people want to stop by, we're there to talk about some of this housing policy, what's going on, what we've been doing. Because when I have those conversations with people who are sort of saying, now what's going on here and what's happening and how fast is this project going and how are we doing this right now in COVID-19? And well, I know that the policy that comes out of this at the end is the one that's right and it was informed by my community. If I feel a little anonymous behind it because we're doing sort of surveys and things, that's sort of a way we want to try and bring the conversation to be a little bit more ongoing and consistent and open. So that's something we're going to try and get off the ground. I'm going to try and start holding them before I go. And then Brian will pick up the reins on them. We'll probably tag team them from here on out. But so that's something we're going to try and do. You guys, so think about it. You might get something from me in the sort of next week or week and a half saying, hey, this is when this is happening. You want to push it out there to the world. So that's, we want to be as open and available to bring together groups of people to have a conversation as we can be. And, if we have noticed meetings like this, we have noticed meetings like this. But if we also have drop-in hours where people can just come by and ask staff what's going on, then we want to do that too.
Caitlin, what's the status with the vacancy on the planning board? Is the town council taking applications? Do they have a date for interviews?
Yeah, so they are accepting applications. They have, I believe, right now there is one person who has applied to be on the planning board. They have not yet interviewed them, and so I'm curious whether or not that interview is going to be scheduled now that they just did the reappointments. I think it will be, but that is also a good point to know. It's not very often that there's a vacancy on our planning board, and we do have a vacancy on the planning board now. So if you read the word about that, we would love to have a good pool of applicants and make sure that we always really work very hard to see that the planning board has got a balance of different opinions, because that's how we keep ourselves all in check with one another. And if you got an application you want to put in or know somebody who might, they should get in touch with the clerk.
Who stepped down, Caleb?
Elise Torello stepped down.
Oh.
Is there, and there might not be, but any sort of status updates on various projects this group has been working on, like the ADU stuff?
Yep, I can tell you what I know about ADUs.
There's a couple of projects. I mean, one of the ones I'd bring up.
Go for it, Joe.
I was going to say, one of the projects that came in front of the board that I don't think has come in front of affordable housing was the affordable housing project that Scott Hallback had for, I want to say, Columbia Street. And I forgot exactly how many units, but that would create, at least the initial thought would be that it would create 3 affordable units, 2 which he's proposing would be rental and 1 that he's affording the home ownership.
And that's actually neat because it is a cottage proposal that's being put forward. So the person of me who looks at everything in a sort of silver lining and best way to coordinate things, it's an interesting time to be considering how you want to regulate them permanently at the same time as you have an application that's a comprehensive permit. So it's not bounded by these regulations we're writing, that the planning board is actually working through looking at what it physically will be to be built. It's a great way to have your regulations not be built only in theory, but by actually thinking through an actual project too. On ADUs, Josh, I talked to Rob just before the meeting, and I asked him whether or not, I was like, did ADUs go forward and I missed them, or what has happened on ADUs? Because I figured you guys were going to ask. And because it is, I thought he was trying to wrap it in with budget. And what he told me was, because it's budget neutral, it's not money we have today. So it's not money we're worrying about forgiving or not counting on having. He he didn't put it forward in that. So my thought is that when we move forward the ADU regulations for the zoning, we'll also be moving forward the tax relief thing at the same time. There's no reason to have those conversations separately.
What about something like we had at one point sort of touched on the idea of tax abatements around like Section 8 rentals or things like that, which was something I was going to suggest for a future meeting. I mean, is that something that needs to wait for any regulatory or zoning changes to be considered?
Nope.
No. Okay.
Or is that, and also the tax abatement around like the effectively sort of not buying deeds, but you know, that conversation that we're having. So
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like that one was more thorny because we were just trying to figure out formulas and what would be tolerable.
right.
But I mean, that's, you know, that's some of the work that we have that's sort of been ongoing and was paused for a little while. So maybe we can resume a little bit of that.
Do we want to pick those things up as agenda items for next time? Any of those?
I'm certainly open to that. I don't know if anybody has feedback on where to start.
Yeah, I guess just what needs to be done next on any of them.
Just to have some clarification about what we can actually do.
Yeah.
Okay.
The
Agreed.
last thing that happened with that, I think, is we had Rob was actually taking our thoughts from that one meeting from whenever ago, and he was putting it into a document. And I think the last time we met, if I'm not mistaken, he hadn't quite finished that yet, and it was sort of forthcoming. So maybe see if Rob's got something from that. That was sort of the
Sounds
plan.
like a plan.
Yeah, just to see where we ended up, because you're right, the deed buyback thing got very thorny. That's putting it lightly, Jen. But some of the other stuff was a little bit more low hanging fruit, and it was within that document that Rob was sort of pulling together, because I had done like a bunch of thoughts. A couple other people had done a bunch. We sort of combined them all and discussed them, and he was going to put something together. And I don't think we ever saw that, unless I'm mistaken. Unless you guys can remember seeing anything.
No, we never got past sort of the first look at the first draft.
Yeah. Okay.
We might have to, you know, leave some of the, like you said, I think, you know, go with the low hanging fruit and maybe, you know, table the thornier stuff potentially or not. But yeah, the other piece of discussion was the conversation with the village trust and like how the town might frame ability for them for an organization like that to kind of come to the town for funding. I'm just bringing all these conversations back to mind.
Well, yes, it's good for us all to be back together thinking about it, and I'm sure we'll have new things too that we'll want to add to the list. So. Okay, so anything else on that? Planning updates? No. Okay. And then we were going to just check in about whether folks wanted to get back on our regular schedule and meet June 25th, which would be our fourth Thursday of this month. I don't know if we think our developer who couldn't come tonight will be ready and want to present at that point. Any guesses?
I spend so much of my days guessing on when development is ready for what. I am not sure. They got feedback from the planning board at their hearing last week about a general lack of feeling that the units as proposed were very well integrated. And what they had reached out to me and said was, we think we're going to do some redesign here. We heard that loud and clear. We'd like to bring it back to the Affordable Housing Collaborative when we've had another whack at that problem, instead of coming in to hear more of the concern we've already heard and we're trying to adjust to. So they are redesigning. They, I think, are hopeful to have something for the end of the month. And so I think they are probably hopeful to be on an end of June meeting with you all. Yeah, if they're not, they will also still have time to catch you at your July regular meeting before the planning board needs to make a decision on that application. So it'll a bit be just on their timeline. If they're ready, then I think they'd love to see you all in June. If not, then they could meet you in July.
So I imagine we don't have the same vacations we normally do in the summer, and I'm gonna throw it out like that. But it will be the week after school's gotten out and stuff. Are folks available for a June 25th meeting if we try to get back on our schedule?
Can I ask another question about that? Because I mean, in some ways, even if we're on vacation,
Right in this.
these are Zoom meetings anyway. So does the town have any thoughts in terms of,
So true.
yeah, when meetings might go back to in person versus Zoom?
Yeah. So I think I'm gonna paraphrase how someone said it very well the other day and better than I. I think so long as we are enabled to be holding Zoom meetings, the Zoom meetings will stay. And I think that if Zoom meetings go away, it will be because our authority to hold Zoom meetings was taken away.
Okay.
At least I would say, based on that, I would expect that these are probably here for about a year. I mean, I think anytime we're concerning about if there are any required restrictions on gatherings of people at public meetings, anything like that, we've been finding Zoom is more or less working for most of our committees. And so if it's working, then that's probably gonna stay. I think is probably what you'll see.
All right, well, I'm going to suggest that we just go for it and meet in June. I hope I see a bunch of you here. Anybody have anything else for future meetings that they want to throw out, or anything else before we adjourn? The quietest Zoom room ever. So do I have a motion to adjourn then?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right. Glad to see everybody again.
You too. Good to see you guys.
I know.
Good
Good
to
night,
meet
everybody.
Night.
Nice to meet you, Brian. Good night.